Hello. Well, you've most probably never heard of Chris Cash, Christopher Berry, Jonathan Powell, or for that matter, Lord Hermer. Yet all four of these gentlemen stand at the heart of what is rapidly becoming one of the most revealing and perhaps troubling political scandals in recent British history. Chris Cash was a parliamentary researcher. He worked close to the heart of government, had access to parliamentary committees and to senior ministers. He knew what was going on. Christopher Berry, well, he was a journalist, a man whose job it was to report on politics and provide political commentary, not to shape and manipulate politics. Both were arrested. Both were charged under the Official Secrets Act with allegedly passing information to the Chinese state. On the other hand, Jonathan Powell is Britain's National Security Advisor. He is the government's chief coordinator on all things to do with intelligence and security policy. And Lord Hermer, well, he is the Attorney General, and the Attorney General is the government's most senior legal advisor and sits on the cabinet. And together, they are key figures in the government's handling of this entire affair. And the affair, this case, is known simply as the Chinese spy case. It should have been a straightforward legal prosecution. Two alleged spies, Cash and Berry, accused of passing sensitive information to a hostile state. However, this week, that case, the Chinese spy case, collapsed. It did not collapse for lack of evidence. It did not collapse because procedures weren't correctly followed. It collapsed because the British government refused to provide the evidence. In Britain, prosecutions of this nature are overseen by something called the Crown Prosecution Service, or the CPS. That is the public independent body that decides whether evidence gathered by the police and intelligence agencies is good enough, or whether or not it's in the national interest to bring a case to trial. The head of the Crown Prosecution Service, a chap with the title Director of Public Prosecutions, formally asked the government to confirm that China is considered a threat. The government refused, and without that statement the prosecution could not proceed. So that is why the case collapsed. Now, to you in America, that may sound incomprehensible. Your government has just imposed 130% tariffs on China in response to Beijing's economic coercion and its restriction of critical minerals vital to your defence and technology industries. You in America have made clear, and you have said out loud, what we in Britain know to be true, namely that China is a strategic rival and an active intelligence threat. But here in Britain, the difference is our government cannot even bring itself to say the word hostile. Our own intelligence agencies have said that China is a threat. Select committees of Parliament have said that China is a threat, and so have former cabinet ministers. All of these have warned that China is systemically engaged in espionage against the United Kingdom, attempting to infiltrate our research institutions and gain access to R&D information, engineering, science, technology, and indeed seeking to influence political and policy affairs and decisions. Now, the Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, is reportedly absolutely furious at the collapse of this case. He's said to be considering using his powers to compel the government to release the information demanded by the Director of Public Prosecutions. That would be a constitutional move without precedent in modern times, which illustrates how serious this affair is. But in America, this, to you, may seem an isolated incident. It's not. It's a pattern that stretches from espionage to diplomacy and from our courts to our foreign policy. At the very moment that this case was collapsing, the British government, the Labour-led British government, has been negotiating with Mauritius over the future of the Chagos Islands, the British Indian Overseas Territory. Negotiations that have been shrouded in opacity and have perhaps strategic and profound implications. The Chagos archipelago, and particularly the island of Diego Garcia, has for decades been one of the most critical bases from which America and Britain has projected power. It is from there that US bombers and surveillance aircraft have operated for decades across the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific region. Yet Britain is now pursuing an agreement that could see sovereignty over these islands transferred against the wishes of the Chagosian people and in the face of extreme concerns over Chinese influence over Mauritius, and that it could one day lead to Beijing getting direct access to the islands themselves. Meanwhile, also here in London, a vast new Chinese embassy complex is being prepared, reportedly the largest in Europe. It will sit, extraordinarily, directly above one of the main nexus points of Britain's, or at least London's, communications network, a convergence of underground data cables carrying financial traffic from the City of London and even the government itself. Britain's intelligence services have objected to this new build embassy. The Labour government, however, and indeed the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, a Labour mayor, both support it. Together, these three developments, the failed prosecution, the Chagos negotiations, and the new embassy, form a pattern of appeasement. It is a pattern in which the government, the British government, refuses to defend our national interests or to confront those who would exploit this nation's openness. Now, going back to Jonathan Powell, the National Security Advisor, and Lord Hermer, the Attorney General, all of these matters will have crossed their desks, and those two gentlemen will have had a say in their management. And you'd be right to assume that that has raised a great many eyebrows here in Britain. And it may not just be for fear of economic retaliation that drives this. There is within the Labour movement an ideological sympathy with the Chinese model, a fascination perhaps of its blend of state power, economic planning and social control. For some, China represents not a threat, but a kind of example, an ideological role model, a state that has achieved order and direction through authority and control rather than freedom. And one would be perhaps forgiven for thinking or suspecting that the government's cozying up to Beijing, its crackdown on free speech on social media, and its plans for digital ID cards that would be required to access any kind of public or private services may all be part of the same ideological agenda. The British people are not blind to this. The British people are not afraid to defend their country. What we face, though, is not public fear, but governmental betrayal and cowardice, a failure of political integrity, democratic values, and courage, all disguised as legalistic diplomacy. And now there are reports that concern is growing in the United States, there in Washington, that the White House is watching carefully, and it would be right to do so. Officials in Washington apparently have said that they and the Pentagon are uneasy and worried that Britain's reluctance to confront China could undermine intelligence sharing between our two great nations. And who could blame them for being worried about this? For how can we speak of security partnership when one of us cannot even bring ourselves to name the threat that we both face? Once Britain stood proud as a watchtower, small but resolute, a bastion perhaps, confident in its judgment and clear in its aims and steadfast in its loyalty to its friends and allies. But now, Britain risks becoming something else, or rather not Britain. Our government risks forcing Britain to become something else, a nation paralysed by the government's timidity and afraid to speak the truth aloud even to our closest friends, such as you in America. A truth that you act on and we don't. So if you find yourself bemused by Britain's behaviour, by our government's refusal to name the danger that so plainly exists, understand this, please. It is not because the British people have lost their spirit, courage or loyalty, but because those who lead us have lost theirs. And in the end, perhaps that is the most dangerous failure of all.
That was Letter to America by Henry Bolton. For further episodes, please follow or subscribe. Thank you.